Wonderful. Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm also very aware that being the last speaker, I'm also standing between you and drinks, right? So I hope I don't take too much of your time. But thanks very much for the introduction. And I think, yes, I will explain what a forward is, just to give a bit of a background, because it also frames the approach for this conversation. And I will be speaking on, it's a different approach, let's put it that way, but I'll be speaking on the intersection between cultural diplomacy, migration and development, and the role of the African diaspora. So AFORD is the African Foundation for Development. It's a diaspora and development organization which was set up in the UK in '94 with a mission to enhance and expand the diaspora's contributions to Africa's development. And we have a priority area of focus on enterprise and employment. AFORD started off much more as a think tank. And so in the first sort of 10 years of our work, we did quite a lot of conceptualization and development and production of research around the diaspora's contribution to the continent, to Africa. And this included, understanding the ways in which the diaspora are organized, as well as the ways in which the diasporas give back to the continent. And we came up with these 6 forms of contribution, which is around finance, intellectual capital, social, political, cultural, and time. And there was a whole range of other research that we put there as well. Essentially, AFORD has been a pioneer in the space of diaspora and development. Had you spoken about diaspora and development in the 90s, everyone would think about the Jewish diaspora and not about the African diaspora. But that is now very much established in a lot of policy around the world. Our work is really about how we structure diaspora contributions to the continent, because essentially diaspora contributions are personal, right? Within those 6 forms that we spoke about. So you've got the individual contributions going in, and you have some examples there at the very top, which is around remittances. The data from 2022, $100 billion going into Africa, which is much more than FDI, much more than ODA. Within that, Egypt received the highest at 28 billion, and Nigeria and Sub-Saharan Africa at 21 billion. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like. Now on the cultural one, which I will build up on a little bit more. So this is around diaspora cultural capital, and I'm sharing a few snapshots of this just so that it frames the conversation as well. But essentially, and this is not an exhaustive list either, but of course the diaspora are seen as bridge builders between resident and heritage countries. They are seen to can foster mutual understanding between cultures. They're also ambassadors, and at the same time they're also markets for ethnic food and arts and music and fashion and so forth. And they can help to shape narratives as well on migration and culture, and are also advocates for development and for change. Now, one of the areas that we work on, so AFORD has a number of different areas that we work on. Enterprise and employment is our focus and is the priority, but within that we've also got a fair number of areas around remittances, and under the culture theme we actually have a focus on restitution, which is about returning stolen African artifacts. So there have been a number of conversations that have been started and research that we have produced, and I'm happy to share some links to these as well afterwards. But again, this is the angle at which the discussions or what the thoughts and ideas that I want to share with you are also coming from. So in terms of the intersection between cultural diplomacy, migration, and development, globally, this topic has been, especially between culture and migration, has been high on the agenda. Earlier this year, I had the privilege of speaking on one of the opening sessions of the UN's Global Forum on Migration and Development under Culture, Narratives, and Migration. And prior to this, through the Global Civil Society mechanism, culture and narratives had been a key focus with virtual global conversations taking place across the world. What was missing in the international discussions, though, however, which I sought to bring, was the connection also with development, and for the purposes of this conversation, mainly on socioeconomic development. For the thinking essentially is that this not only has the power to strengthen and improve communication around diaspora and migrant narratives, but under cultural diplomacy, as we enhance development, it can also promote international cooperation and cultural understanding. As per one of the global civil society recommendations, the role of culture in creating a development model must be one that incorporates and grounds migration narratives in restorative justice, while at the same time also providing opportunities for socioeconomic development in countries of heritage. Culture and development, if executed well, can also enhance cultural diplomacy, not just between states, but also between different communities. So in terms of the role of the African diaspora within this intersection, I've attempted to conceptualize this in 3 different areas. So the diaspora as bridge builders and cultural ambassadors, diaspora as advocates for change, and diaspora as markets for and enablers of socioeconomic development. So on the first one, under bridge building and cultural ambassadors, the diaspora, as I mentioned earlier, act as bridge builders between their countries of residence and countries of heritage. They often play the role of ambassadors, consuming and thereby promoting arts and music, food, fashion, and so on from their countries of heritage, and often also influencing both cultures as well, here and there, through their transnational networks and movements. Now, the diaspora's role as bridge builders assumes an understanding of at least 2 cultures, 2 places, 2 geographies, and this is often very much also sought after by policymakers. Take London. It's a city of food, music, fashion from all over. Most of these purposefully or not orchestrated by the diaspora from different parts of the world. In relation to Africa, I like to use the example of Afrobeats right here in the UK, or in the West even, which is consumed by all cultures across the younger generation in particular. The diaspora's role as bridge builders and cultural ambassadors is often all around us on a day-to-day basis and can be significant in its contribution to cultural diplomacy. On advocates for change, or the diaspora as advocates for change, the diaspora, another of the civil society recommendations also from the GFMD earlier on in the year, focuses on restitution and its links to colonization. So our Fort's own work on Return of the Icons, which I shared with you earlier, since 2019 has been successfully moving forward key conversations and diaspora advocacy around looted artifacts as well as ancestral remains that are held in Western museums and other cultural institutions. This work has been supported by research involving the 10 R's in the Decolonization and Repair Project, with a 2020 project which mapped which engaged the diaspora around these conversations, called the Restitution of African Artifacts and Human Remains. And as I mentioned, I'm happy to share the links with you later on in terms of where you can find these as well. Note also that diasporas play they play their roles also as shapers of migration narratives and broader cultural discourses that impact on development in heritage countries and countries of residence. So, for example, the diaspora raise issues of how countries are unable to understand their present without reference to the past. They remark on the impact of diminished and half-empty museums in the global south, impacting negatively on heritage tourism and cultural experience offered to the diaspora, among other concerns. A case in point is, for example, the return of 26 items from France to Benin in 2022, which on request by the diaspora was displayed for longer than originally planned in Cotonou, so that the diaspora could view these items during their summer breaks. Following its presentation at the Palace of Presidency in Cotonou, the Ministry of Culture unveiled a plan to build 4 new cultural institutions across the country. As well as economic implications, it is hoped that these new museums will help to turn Benin into one of the most desirable destinations for cultural tourism in Africa. Now, on the third point, as diaspora as markets for and enablers of socioeconomic development, culture does need to be looked at as having potential to drive socioeconomic development in countries of heritage. For socioeconomic development as part of growing cultural heritage and tourism sectors, there's a whole network of policies around restitution that can improve these offers. And these include diaspora and migrant contributions to improving skills in the sector, upskilling young people, supporting educational institutions, as well as leveraging the role of the diaspora as important heritage markets and consumers. A very concrete and recent example of this was Ghana's Year of Return program in 2019, which shows how critical heritage tourism can be, in this case, to African economies. The program attracted more than 1.5 million diaspora visitors, and it generated about 1.8 billion US dollars in additional spending in the country. African countries see the potential for heritage and cultural tourism as drivers of economic activity and employment. Similarly, heritage and culture industries can capitalize on the socioeconomic opportunities that restitution also brings, as well as leveraging on diaspora and migrant skills and their consumer power. All of these provide opportunities for growing African economies moving in the right direction of a more level playing field between developing and developed economies, and in this case, having policies that connect culture, heritage, and development. And this celebration of arts and culture, greater promotion of it at an international level through its development, can also help to bridge the gap between cultures, increase a better understanding, create stronger ties between the countries, as well as between different cultures in one location. Development narratives focused on the diaspora's markets are examples that can also win hearts and minds, not just in countries of residence, but also in countries of origin or in countries of heritage, where there is often among the local population a lack of understanding on the added value of the diaspora. Changing the perception of diaspora and migrants at home is also important, and for example, if they are perceived as investors at home. So there is no question that the diaspora's appetite for culture and heritage can serve as a driver for development in and by heritage tourism, creating a market of diaspora investors and consumers. So the final elements to share with you are, what are the policy implications for migration governance in driving more positive narratives and enhancing cultural diplomacy through the development of culture? And on these, I've segmented these into 4 different areas. So the first one is around institutional engagement, which are needed with new debates, and I've put new in quotes because these are not new debates per se, but they have ramped up over the last few years. Decolonization and related agendas. The importance of restitution campaigns, like the Return of the Icons program, should be seen as opportunities to improve heritage offers alongside national diaspora engagement strategies. The second one is around leveraging diaspora economic contributions. A focus on culture in the context of socioeconomic development means supporting the growth of the culture and the heritage sector. And this can be done through training, coaching, mentoring, essentially a broad range of business development support, and also improving the relevant educational institutions, in particular the technical, vocational, educational, and training sectors, as well as museums in all sorts of relevant skills. And all of this alongside a coordinated effort of skills sharing by experienced diaspora professionals in the sector. The third one is around engagement with multi-generations of diaspora in Africa's development. Through the work that we've done and in our experience, we've seen how these discussions of culture and heritage have become a really strong pull, or are a really strong pull actually, for the historic diaspora, as well as for second, third, and younger generations of diaspora. The aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in the US and other related decolonization agendas have in lots of ways illuminated these discussions in such a way that increasingly we're talking more and more about global diasporas and the interlinkages within the transatlantic space between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And the last point there is that the development of mutually beneficial policies. And culture can also facilitate migration governance policies that benefit countries of heritage as well as countries of residence. And therefore also help to bridge that gap that we've been talking about between cultures and enhance cultural diplomacy. So really, in conclusion, diaspora development can accelerate cultural diplomacy. The diaspora play a key role in the development of heritage countries, and culture as a development enabler can help bridge the gap between cultures and create stronger ties between member states and within multicultural or the multi-ethnic communities. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
So, last point. Any questions? Somebody must have a question. Thank you. Can you introduce yourself, please, sir?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
My name is Pardon, as in I beg your pardon.
Brilliant.
Originally from Zimbabwe,
Brilliant.
and I live here in the UK for 24 years now. Very passionate about your topic. It's something that really resonates with a lot of Africans, and even those that are not from Africa, but the diaspora message is very profound. I'm very passionate about it. Just a background about myself, I actually went back to Zimbabwe to contest as an MP. But what I want to find out from you is how you can, I don't know whether you have experienced the backlash between the diasporans and the locals back home and how receptive that it is. In spite of the fact that we bring in so much from outside, and how is that integration from what you have seen, how that has been? That's my first question. The second question is, what challenges have you faced in terms of the return of the artifacts? Because we have also some issues from Zimbabwe we are trying to do, but because you're moved from one museum to the other and you do not know whose they belong to and who took them, and there's a lot of maybe protocol in terms of trying to retrieve these back. And how successful has that been in terms of some of the models that we have used?
Thank you, Pardon, for the queries. I'll start with the first one in terms of how well, the relationship, if you like, between the diaspora and the locals. I mean, often, as I was saying, it really is down to, again, it's about the narratives that are put out there, right? And often, locally, there isn't very much understanding about the diaspora space and the way that we understand it. Even though a lot of people have people outside the country, they don't make that same link of that person being abroad and supporting me or supporting my children with this sector, right? And a lot of that is down to the communication and to the narratives. Now, if I can use examples like the Ghana one that I shared, because there was so much focus and communication for about 2 years towards the year of return, a lot more people locally began to understand it. But normally the understanding is in the practice, right? So once you have people there and people are able to make, to run their businesses, make a bit more, like money, etc., they begin to have a different perception of how they understand this space. So that can help to facilitate it. But the point about narratives and who is leading that as well and driving it, so the states who would normally have the national diaspora policies really should have policies also around communication, but also more around how you bridge that gap as well, because that is absolutely important, as you said. In Benin as well, as I said, you had the diaspora who really advocated. So the Benin embassy in France was quite instrumental in getting the 26 items back to Benin. And of course, it was during Macron's time, and they had, trying to show a little bit of, I suppose, cultural diplomacy and showing that they were doing something about these issues, and so they agreed in Parliament that they would do so. And once the items went back, he also had the diaspora saying, well, we were part of supporting this. We also want to be able to view these items, so we would like you to put them on display again. And this is very much public knowledge. So I think these conversations and communication as well is very important. On the question around how you return stuff, it's quite complex. I mean, it's from one institution to the other. You know, we have been working across with a lot of community and smaller museums because there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of policies. But there are lots of sensitivities also in different arenas. And I can share a bit more with you in terms of, you know, the research that we did, a lot of the work that we've done. A lot of this is available online as well. But it's not as straightforward as we like. In some cases, some items are being returned on loan, which we do not think is the best way to do it. But there are also other reasons for doing it that way. But yes, I can share a lot more with you on that offline. Thank you.
I think there was one other question.
Yes.
Two
even, yeah.
Two.
Yes, thank you very much for such a succinct kind of clear agenda, really presented from a non-state actor kind of angle. And obviously I was just reading another interesting kind of point whereby it was all these sort of losses were as a product of the gunboat diplomacy at the time, and now we are talking of cultural diplomacy. So, I mean, how do we obviously going to leverage or in fact actually get to a good understanding of the real aspect of human rights in this context of cultural diplomacy, which is how probably afford as an organization can leverage the idea of human rights actually into the concepts of cultural diplomacy there. I am just looking at the immigration, migration sort of perspective. When we look at what happened between 2020 and 2022, you know, whereby people were left to die in the seas under the environment of citizenship is a privilege, not a right, to not admit you to our borders. I mean, how far is afford in terms of actually championing the cause of humanizing immigration?
That's a very good question, and it's, you know, I mean, we've always said on a forward side that, of course, we had also the years from around, 2014 to the end of 2020, where there was, on the side from the narrative from the West, you know, there was an increase, if you like, of numbers coming or traveling irregularly into Europe. But we also know that if you look at the global pictures on the continent, about 90% of people stay on the continent. About 10% move outwards. Of that 10%, a very small percentage use irregular routes, right? So if you look at the numbers that way, we know also that the numbers are quite small. The angle that we come at it is, as I mentioned earlier, our focus is on job creation, right? On decent job creation, because our theory of change, our theory of development is about people being self-sustainable, and therefore we need to focus on our SMEs that create the most jobs and support them to grow, and so forth. So that's the angle at which we come at it. But in relation to issues around human rights, as you're saying, and cultural diplomacy, some of the things that we have looked at is really sort of policies around, you know, like labor migration schemes, right? How do those work? Because we know also that when you have people move, when the diaspora move, or when they become diaspora, if you like, once they move from their countries of heritage to the UK, to wherever they are in Europe, to the US, they contribute even when they're here, right? Now, there is a power in talking about those stories, and also how does that, as you said, how does that fit into the discussions of cultural diplomacy? And some of the things that we have been looking at are the policies that are behind some of the labor migration schemes as well, right? Where, for example, you have people from the medical fields who come over to work. There are so many restrictions around who they can bring over, but at the same time, they're also contributing. But is the West also supporting those institutions there? And there's something around the diaspora's the diaspora's role in that space that can be leveraged in terms of those conversations. And these are some of the things that we are trying to push at the moment. But again, we can talk a lot more about it. I'm just mindful of the time. Yes, there was one more. Yes, please.
On the remittances, you said that Egypt tops followed by Nigeria.
In 2022, yes, but not 2023.
Official or it includes both official and unofficial remittances.
Remittances are normally official because this is what the World Bank records through the various central banks, through through the remittance platforms and so forth. But yes, informally, at least up until before COVID, it was believed that the amount that was going through the formal channels was possibly the same amount going through the informal channels, right? We're not sure where that sits now, obviously, because things changed quite a lot. More people started to use platforms and official channels. But really, I mean, the figures speak for themselves. Even before COVID, it was always above about $80 billion going into the continent. And then 2022, 100 billion. The 2023 data has just come in, which we are compiling, and that has regressed a little bit, but it's still at around $90 billion. So they're absolutely significant. And for us, it tells you the story of the diaspora essentially being a significant stakeholder for the continent.
Thank you. Thank you very much. May we have a big round of applause?